On the evening of the 3rd of September, 1939, a British passenger liner buffeted its way through the North Atlantic Ocean, carrying over 1,400 people, families, tourists, and refugees, homeward bound to North America. Only hours earlier, they'd left a city spiralling into panic. Britain stood on the verge of declaring war on Germany. At Liverpool, nearly all ships scheduled to leave British ports were held, all except for one, the SS Athenia. It seemed like a stroke of luck for the passengers who boarded the ship that day. They'd cleared Hitler's warpath and they believed themselves to be safely on the voyage home to their families in the US and Canada. But it was a voyage Athenia would never finish, because waiting beneath the waves was a terrifying, deadly threat. The sinking of Athenia caused outrage, not just among Britain and its allies, but within the Nazi leadership itself. Its sinking is a story of high drama, but one which would be completely overshadowed by the sheer scale of loss caused during the Second World War. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of the first ship to be sunk by a U-boat in World War II, the SS Athenia. The Athenia story begins with the Anchor Donaldson Line, formed in 1916, with the merger of two shipping companies running services mainly between Britain and Canada. In the 1920s, their biggest ship was the SS Athenia, built at the renowned Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company yard at Govan in Glasgow. Launched on 28th January 1922 and completed a year later, Athenia was a modest workhorse of a passenger liner. She measured a bit more than 13,000 gross registered tons, and at 526 feet, or 160 metres from bow to stern, she was no giant. A sister ship, Letitia, followed soon afterwards, and the pair were exactly the kind of hard-working passenger vessels British shipping companies heavily invested in through the 1920s, as they built up their fleets, which had been decimated by Germany's U-boats in the First World War. Together, the two sister ships became regulars at ports in Liverpool, Glasgow, Quebec, and Montreal in the summer months. When the St. Lawrence River froze over, their services shifted to Halifax, Nova Scotia instead. The two sister ships weren't flashy by any means. They sported a simple white band on their black funnel to match the obsidian shade of their hull. Photographs show simple, light-panelled interiors with plush, floral patterned sofas. Comfortable, sure, but not like the big transatlantic liners on the New York, Liverpool, or Southampton run. What the sisters lacked in glamour, though, they made up for in functionality. Athenia could accommodate up to 516 cabin-class passengers and approximately 1,000 in third class. Her steam turbines drove twin screws, pushing the sturdy liner to respectable speeds at 15 knots. In a nod towards modernity and the ever-shifting pace of hydrodynamic design, Athenia, meanwhile, boasted an elegant spoon-shaped cruiser stern, whose elongated form probably helped her crack that decent cruise speed. In 1933, as migrant numbers declined, Athenia's operators shifted from a focus on immigration services to the tourist trade, and the liner refitted to accommodate a different demographic of passengers: 314 in cabin, 310 in tourist, and 928 in third. Her owners had also ensured she was up to safety standards, stocking her with 1,600 life jackets, 26 lifeboats capable of carrying over 1,800 passengers, and 21 floats. For a moderate-sized ocean liner like Athenia, this was actually a pretty good deal of safety equipment. For the next 6 years, Athenia quietly underwent her business in the North Atlantic passenger trade, and then, in late August 1939, things changed forever, when tensions in Europe began to boil over. That month, Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It outlined the notion that the Soviet Union and Germany wouldn't go to war with each other, and instead, they'd carve up Eastern European countries like Poland between them. Once Hitler shook metaphorical hands with Stalin, the pact was crystallized and the path was cleared for invasion. It came very quickly, on September 1st, 1939. And as Athenia sat riding at her moorings in Glasgow, panic swept through the major cities and towns of Great Britain and Europe like a plague. In the weeks to come, Britons would euthanize more than 700,000 household pets in a paranoid frenzy driven by memories of harsh food rationing from the First War some 25 years earlier. Across European ports, Canadians and Americans scrambled to book ships that could get them home quickly at the last minute. With war looming and Britain preparing to respond to Germany's invasion, the British government swiftly began requisitioning passenger liners for their need of troop ships and armed merchant cruisers, and as many as 9 transatlantic voyages were cancelled on September 1st alone. But there was still one scheduled to head off from Glasgow for Montreal with stops at Belfast and Liverpool, SS Athenia. Those few who managed to secure a spot on board undoubtedly counted their blessings. They were the lucky ones who secured a spot on the ship, and away from the path of destruction Hitler would soon forward through Poland and the rest of Europe. Dark memories of the unrestricted submarine warfare of the First World War haunted merchant captains, their crews and passengers that autumn, memories of the Lusitania and the blockades. Athenia was a ticket out of a very troubled corner of the globe for home, only the SS Athenia was on her own path to destruction. Just hours after Germany had invaded Poland, Athenia quietly slipped from Liverpool at 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, September 2nd, 1939. She steamed unescorted under the command of the capable Captain James Cook. When they arrived at Liverpool, Cook had followed orders and gone ashore to visit the Admiralty for instruction. Everybody was waiting for Britain's declaration of war on bated breath. It could come at any moment, and it would mark Athenia and any other ships like her that flew the British merchant ensign out as a target. He was given instructions to make a more northerly course than usual, a course that, if war should break out, might keep Athenia safe and out of the busy sea lanes that the big transatlantic liners usually followed between Britain and the United States and Canada. Naturally, it was thought the U-boat commanders would be instead hungrily patrolling those waters from day one. Crammed on board Cook's ship were more than 1,400 passengers and crew, 200 or so more than what she could comfortably accommodate in peacetime, and at least 3/4 of those passengers were women and children. Britain hadn't yet formally entered the war when Athenia sailed, so many on board believed the vast Atlantic Ocean gave them an added measure of safety. Another element working in Athenia's favour was the London Submarine Protocol, an agreement that 35 countries, including Germany, had signed back in 1936, which essentially forbade enemy ships to attack unarmed merchant vessels at sea without warning. Instead, they would have to adhere to the cruiser rules, surfacing and ordering the ship to heave to in preparation for boarding. A warship, whether surface vessel or submarine, the protocol stated, may not sink or render incapable of navigation a merchant vessel without having first placed passengers, crew and ship's papers in a place of safety. Only a few hours into the voyage, passengers enjoyed the soft autumn sun on the ship's upper decks. Excited children wriggled in their mothers' arms, while their fathers reclined in the deck chairs, cigarettes and pipes in hand, settling into what was supposed to be a relatively quick trip back to Canada. But this was not the usual peacetime trip. The mood was understandably tense. At least, most must have thought they were bound for home and had escaped the madness. Meanwhile, Hitler ignored the British deadline to begin withdrawing soldiers from Poland. At 11:15 a.m, the Sunday morning of 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced over the radio that Britain was officially at war with Germany.
His action shows convincingly that there is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force. We have done all that any country could do to establish peace, and now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage.
It was the declaration heard around the world. Here, less than a quarter of a century after the so-called war to end all wars, it was happening again. Britain was going to war with Germany and its allies. Captain Cook pinned the notice on the ship's announcement board. In a matter of moments, shocked whispers scattered throughout the crowded liner. Yet shock quickly gave way to a kind of detached relief. Those on the Athenia had narrowly evaded the catastrophes that would soon unfold in Britain. Or so they thought. By nightfall, on the 3rd, Athenia was around 60 nautical miles south of Rockall, a tiny granite islet that juts alarmingly up from the middle of the ocean, about 280 miles or 450 kilometres west of the Scottish Hebrides. Around 7:30 p.m, Captain Cook joined his first-class passengers for dinner in the lavishly panelled saloon, and he sat down for his meal. The mood must not have been as jovial as a regular peacetime voyage, but with drinks flowing and the wide-open Atlantic ahead of them, passengers must have felt somewhat soothed. But that night, so far off the coast of Scotland, and supposedly in the safety of the open ocean, Athenia was not alone. She was being watched by a 26-year-old German, Kapitän Oberleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp. Through his periscope aboard the German submarine U-30, he eyed the silhouette of the ship in the darkness. Captain Lemp was one of the youngest officers to command one of the Third Reich's U-boats. He'd been born in a German concession leased from China at Tsingtao. His time with the Navy had proved him to be a cool, level-headed character. Like his fellow commanders, Lemp was instructed to follow the cruiser rules. For the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, following the cruiser rules wasn't simply a matter of legality in the early stages of the war, but a political necessity. Hitler wished to avoid provoking neutral nations, especially the United States, into joining Britain and France for the fight. After all, it had been the German submarine attack on Lusitania which had so dramatically shifted public opinion against Germany in the last war. Even so, the U-boat fleet, touted by Commander Karl Dönitz as an elite volunteer force, had been deployed to strategically important sea lanes and busy coastlines to hunt for merchant traffic caught out by the sudden declaration of war. They'd been deployed like that 3 times in the last year, in the wake of the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, as tensions with Great Britain seethed. But this time, it was the real deal. Now, Lemp had a British vessel in his sights, except that she had the obvious silhouette of a passenger steamer. But the ship Captain Lemp saw through his periscope seemed to be behaving erratically, not at all like a regular merchant or passenger ship. All the lights had been blacked out, and it was zigzagging like an auxiliary cruiser. Or so he said. On closer inspection, Lemp thought he saw deck guns shrouded under canvas. He ordered his men to ready the torpedoes and fed the target information into the torpedo data computer. It was about 7:40 p.m. when a young boy, Donald Wilcox from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, leant against the ship's railing, staring down at the white foam curling away from the prow. For the last hour, he had cheerfully watched the last bits of sun flare across the horizon and enjoyed the wind rustling his hair. But suddenly, the whole ship seemed to lurch. Athenia's bow jerked violently upwards, lifting several feet into the air before it came crashing back down again with a heavy roar. Donald staggered backwards, away from the railing. At dinner, Captain Cook staggered up from his chair at the table and rushed for the bridge. On U-30, Lemp had watched his hydrophone operator listening closely to the progress of the 2 torpedoes. One, the operator said, was snaking its way towards the target, but the other seemed to be gaining speed and sound. Terrified that the torpedo might circle back and strike its own U-boat, Lemp ordered U-30 to plunge deeper into the ocean. U-30 wasn't hit, but Athenia was. One torpedo had found its mark on the port side aft, just level with the ship's engine room, severing her oil lines. Smoke and soot erupted in a racket of sound from the blast, and the steamer's turbines whined to a halt. With steam on the dynamos dying out, the ship's lights faded to a dull red before they blinked out for good. Startled passengers who had only just been enjoying a fine dinner were plunged suddenly into darkness. Worse still, they began to feel a strange shuddering beneath their feet. Their ship was beginning to ride lower and lower in the water. In the decks below, foamy seawater surged into the engine room and stokehold, churning through the corridors and the lower passageways. Dazed passengers blindly scrambled up stairwells in the pitch black, lighting matches to help guide their way. Captain Cook had arrived on the bridge and bellowed out for the watertight doors to be shut. Meanwhile, the wirelessman was ordered to fire off an urgent distress call. Athenia was not okay. A cloud of smoke was pouring out of her port quarter, and the ship was listing hard over. Clearly, she had been hit, but whether it was a torpedo or a shell wasn't yet known. Now, Cook and his 1,400 passengers and crew had been thrust suddenly into a fight for survival hundreds of miles from a friendly shore. There was only one thing for it: to uncover the boats and get them swung out. The crew hastily bellowed instructions to the frantic passengers, ordering them towards the boat deck as the ship continued to settle to port. Under Cook's watchful eye, the boats were filled and slowly jerked over the side. As ever, the list presented problems for the crew, who had to struggle with the big boats to get them swung out and away from the ship against the sharp angle as she plunged. It started as an orderly affair, but the gravity of the situation began to sink in. On the outer decks, women and children were first ushered into the lifeboats, but it soon seemed that space was limited. Fearing their children wouldn't be able to secure a spot on a boat, frantic parents began simply tossing their children into the boats like sacks of flour. One couple wrapped their young child, Rosemary Cass Beggs, tightly in a blanket and tossed her into lifeboat 14. For the poor girl, this was nothing short of terrifying. She had been separated from her parents. She had no way of knowing if she'd ever see them again. Meanwhile, another distraught mother, Georgia Hayworth, held her two daughters firmly in her iron grip. Her youngest, 10-year-old Margaret, had been heavily struck on the head by shrapnel when the torpedo exploded, and she bleeded profusely, while her eldest, Jacqueline, clung to her mother's skirts, ducking away from the elbows and knees of passengers hoping to secure a spot on the boat. Amongst the skirmish, Jacqueline was forced apart from her mother and into a different lifeboat, a day she remembered years on as the worst day of her life. Back on the submarine, Captain Lemp watched on, perplexed. He'd surfaced U-30 to get a better glimpse at the target. Through his binoculars now, in the freshening night air, he saw the lifeboats swinging violently on their davits as blackened figures were ushered in. He was frustrated though. It had been some time, and the big ship was really taking its time going down. He ordered a third torpedo to be readied and fired, but apparently it failed. Then he ordered the boat's deck gun readied to finish off the job, and he consulted the Lloyd's Register of Vessels. Lemp compared one shape to the silhouette of the ship before him. Athenia was her name. She was marked out as a passenger ship. With dawning dread, and as the vessel's distress call crackled over the wireless, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had not struck an auxiliary cruiser, as he'd confidently assumed. Instead, he'd attacked a liner that now had hundreds of distressed women and children scampering for the lifeboats. It was a stark, direct violation of the London Submarine Protocol and, worst of all, orders from the top of the German Navy. What a mess, he muttered to nobody in particular. Knowing his mistake would send his Führer into a seething rage, Lemp did not report the sinking or the attack to high command, and he didn't stop to assist. Instead, he turned U-30 about and slinked off into the night. Aboard Athenia, the flooding had been stemmed by the watertight bulkheads and the doors. She was sinking mercifully slowly. It gave her crew time to swing out and lower all 26 boats from the davits. For the next hour, the crew worked like lions to get the boats away. It wasn't easy going against the list. A couple of the boats had dropped, stories into the sea, ejecting their occupants violently. Meanwhile, the launched boats drifted helplessly on the dark Atlantic swell, which sent the boats relentlessly up and down, up and down. The survivors huddled together, but the seasickness became unbearable for many. Some heaved over the side, but others still emptied their stomachs on the backs of their fellow passengers. In Lifeboat 14, one survivor, Michael McShane, was one of only 5 men actually capable of rowing against the chop. Nearly 80 people were crammed into that boat, many of them injured, some too weak to move, and all of them depended on McShane and the others to keep the boat from capsizing. But with so few actually able to pull an oar, McShane and the 4 other men could barely make any headway. Their backs strained against the force of their oars as they struggled to keep the bow pointed into the waves. But then another problem presented itself. The boat's plugs were missing. The lifeboats had holes that remained unplugged, so they didn't fill with rainwater during normal operation, but in the haste of the evacuation, nobody had thought to put the bloody things back in. Before long, the bottom of the lifeboat filled with a foul, odious mixture of seawater and fuel oil, sloshing about the survivors' legs. They began frantically bailing out what they could with hats, buckets, and anything else that came to hand. Hours crept by in the drizzling rains, icy winds and sharp ocean spray, and just when help felt like it would never come, at 2 a.m, the floodlights of an approaching ship cut through the murk. It was a Norwegian freighter, the Knut Nelson. McShane and the other men furiously rowed against the waves, but they simply didn't have enough energy left to reach salvation. They drifted helplessly and waved in hope. The Knut Nelson was a special kind of ship. She was an early pioneering diesel-engine motor vessel. She'd responded to the urgent calls for help and made speed for the scene. Made all the easier because she was empty of cargo. Soon enough, the scattered boats spotted her lights and hove into view, while the Norwegian crew threw rope ladders over the side and rigged canvas chairs. Athenia's No. 5 lifeboat came alongside the Norwegian freighter, and it was secured astern of No. 12 boat. But barely 15 feet away, the tanker's exposed propeller spun sharply in the water above the surface because Knut Nelson was empty. She rode higher in the water, and it exposed the top of her propeller's blades. Once all the passengers from No. 12 lifeboat had been transferred aboard, the empty craft was cut loose and immediately swallowed by the sea. Then, it was Boat 5's turn, but suddenly, and without warning, the boat swung astern, and it was swept straight into the thrashing bronze propeller. In an instant, the lifeboat was fed through the blades as they lazily chopped the water, tearing flesh and wood alike to ribbons. Survivors in nearby boats like McShane's watched in pale horror, many not at first comprehending the carnage they had just witnessed. 50 women and children had been aboard, with 3 crew, and only 8 people were fished from the water alive. It was a horrific moment in an otherwise almost textbook rescue. The Knut Nelson took on over 400 survivors, and the Norwegian ship wasn't alone. The floodlights from the Swedish luxury yacht Southern Cross swept through the darkness, spotting more lifeboats floating helplessly in the swell. Ropes were cast over the side, and some 376 enfeebled survivors clambered aboard, half frozen, nearly delirious. Rosemary Cass Beggs was one of them. She was still swaddled in her bundle of blankets. She fell asleep in the arms of the heroic oarsman, Michael McShane. At first light, a third rescue ship, the Royal Navy destroyer, HMS Electra, crested the horizon, presenting a stark grey silhouette against the rising sun. She was soon joined by another destroyer, HMS Escort, and the American freighter City of Flint. One by one, they hauled the shivering survivors from their lifeboats. But the calamity was not yet over. Just before dawn at 5 a.m, a heavy swell lifted Lifeboat 6 under Southern Cross's stern. The boat went over onto its side, spilling its complement out. 10 were crushed and killed outright, and still 3 more were killed in the rescue attempt, crushed themselves between lifeboats and the steel hulls of the rescue ships. But even as Athenia's passengers were plucked from the cold water, the valiant liner refused to sink. For 14 full hours, she stayed there, wallowing in the Atlantic chop, with her stern submerging. Then, right at the end, another moment of high drama unfolded. The chief officer, Barnett Copeland, had escaped, and he was going through a passenger list aboard HMS Electra. To his horror, he realised a woman was missing, but he knew exactly where she was. The day before, she had fallen down a ladder on Athenia, knocked her head, and she was badly concussed. She'd been taken unconscious to the sickbay and put to bed by the ship's doctor. In the chaos of the sinking, Copeland had sent 2 men to fetch her, but clearly they had failed. He looked in shocked horror at Athenia, which was so obviously about to sink for good. He raced to Electra's captain to beg for a boat. Permission granted, he took a few men and raced over and hopped aboard the stricken liner, ran down below where water was sloshing up to their knees. They burst through the sickbay doors, and there she was, still tucked soundly in bed, still unconscious. Copeland and his men bundled her up and hauled her out into a boat. They set off again, and not a moment too soon. Just moments later, sometime around 11 a.m. ship's time, the valiant Athenia gave out, and she slipped beneath the waves for good, with a roar and a whoosh of white spray. As the rescue vessels turned slowly eastward for the long journey back to Britain, passengers crowded the cabins and the passageways. The crew moved tirelessly among them, handing out warm blankets and hot tea, tending to the exhausted and the wounded. Those aboard the Southern Cross were transferred over to the American ship, City of Flint, which was less than half the tonnage of the Athenia, bound on a 10-day passage to Canada. Yet, with each passing day, camaraderie between the survivors grew. They created a ship's newspaper and knitted clothes for the children. But as the weary survivors aboard the rescue ships gazed across the grey ocean, strewn with floating debris, an oil slick, and pale floating bodies, the full realization of what had just happened sank in. The war had found them after all. Of the 1,418 passengers and crew aboard, 117 lost their lives, 98 passengers and 19 crew. The declaration made by Britain was just hours old. They had the dubious distinction of being the survivors of the very first ship to be torpedoed by a German U-boat in the war. But the question was, which U-boat had done it? Three weeks after the sinking, Lemp and the U-30 arrived at Wilhelmshaven, where he was met by senior U-boat fleet officers, and chief among them was none other than Karl Dönitz himself. Kemp sheepishly confessed he had attacked a passenger ship, and it was the Athenia. Dönitz went purple in the face. By then, Athenia's sinking had made headlines around the globe. For example, the Halifax Herald published on its front page the headline, "Liner Athenia is torpedoed and sunk, Empire at war." With no U-boat having claimed the kill, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder had vehemently denied German involvement. The German Navy believed this to be nothing but British propaganda, a lie spun to turn neutral nations, especially the United States, against Germany. But now, Lemp confirmed it was all true. Dönitz immediately ordered the young captain onto a plane for Berlin to explain himself to Raeder. Lemp maintained that his attack on Athenia was an honest mistake, that the ship appeared to be zigzagging like an auxiliary cruiser, and that it had its lights blacked out. But whether Raeder believed Lemp's testimony or not didn't really matter. Hitler could not afford to have the Americans involved in the war, so Lemp evaded a court-martial with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. According to Dönitz's statements in the 1946 Nuremberg trial, he had punished Lemp only by confining him to his quarters, like a naughty boy sent to his room. In the interim, though, Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, spun a new theory that accused the British themselves of sinking Athenia instead. This was soon accompanied by the Nazi Party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter's headline, "Churchill sinks Athenia," which hit the presses on the 23rd of October. To Goebbels' credit, this was a calculated move to make the subsequent theories he fed to the press seem more plausible. The German press claimed that Britain's new First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, had planted a bomb on board Athenia in an attempt to sink the ship and doom its American passengers, to try to bait the United States into joining the war against Germany. The Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive as it desperately tried to shift the blame. They claimed that shipping agents were told to not board German citizens in case they witnessed Churchill's scheme, that rescue ships were mysteriously in the area despite Athenia never having sent a distress call. And then, British destroyers opened fire on the ship and sank it, so any trace of the scheme was erased. This, of course, was ridiculous. Athenia had fired off a distress call. It had been picked up by neutral Norwegian and Swedish ships that had rushed to the scene. Few outside of Germany believed the lies, and across the pond, the United States watched safely from a distance. 28 Americans had died with Athenia, but the states still decided to stay out of this new European conflict. The government chalked it up to some kind of horrible mistake, and that was the end of it.
Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
I think we should stay out of it entirely.
Let Europe fight our own battles. They mean nothing to us.
We should mind our own business. By all means, no.
Not only did Lemp evade any real punishment, but he was later awarded the Iron Cross in late September and promoted to the rank of Kapitänleutnant. In those early days, he was one of the Kriegsmarine's most successful U-boat men, but the war would catch up with Lemp. In 1940, he was in command of the U-110, when the submarine was depth-charged into submission and forced to surface. She was captured, along with her critical Enigma machine and her codebooks, and Kapitänleutnant Lemp was lost in the ocean and never seen again. On the destroyers HMS Electra and Escort, the rescued passengers were delivered to the Scottish port Greenock, arriving late on September 4th, 1939. Meanwhile, others aboard the Norwegian freighter, the Knut Nelson, were carried to Galway, Ireland, where ambulances waited on them at the quayside. Many survivors stepped ashore in silence, too stunned to speak. Some had lost relatives, while others still searched the crowds for a familiar face that would never appear. 6 days after the sinking, young Margaret Hayworth, who had been struck on the head by shrapnel, succumbed to her wounds. Her body was transported to Halifax and then by train to Hamilton, where at least 1,000 people came out to greet her body's arrival. She was gently laid to rest eternally, and a nation bowed their heads in sorrow. Canadians were incensed by her death, and they enlisted in droves. Chief Officer Copeland was honoured for his act of bravery, dashing over to rescue the female passenger with the concussion. He was awarded the OBE in January of 1940, but sadly the woman he'd saved never awoke from her coma, and she died 2 weeks later. There were some brighter outcomes and happy reunions. Rosemary Beggs was eventually reunited with her parents in Montreal. Medical aid, clothing, and telephone services were quickly organised so passengers could contact anxious relatives who had read the jarring headlines about the sinking. Both Canadian and American governments later expressed their gratitude to the Irish and British for taking in their people, especially at Galway and Glasgow. When the survivors finally crossed the Atlantic to Canada aboard the neutral American rescue ship City of Flint, they were met at sea by US Coast Guard cutters and escorted to Halifax Harbour on 13th of September, where a huge crowd and big government officials awaited their arrival. It had been a jarring, horrendous experience, but at last, these men and women were home, safe. Athenia was the first of many big ships lost in a war which eventually grew to such a scale, both in physical size and cruelty, that its sinking was completely overshadowed. Britain was subjected to disaster after disaster in those early months. In the wake of the frantic Dunkirk evacuations, the Cunarder turned troopship Lancastria was torpedoed with a simply shocking death toll, some 6,000 men killed. But this was just the beginning. The next year, the Soviet hospital ship Armenia was busy evacuating refugees when she was caught by German bombers and sent to the bottom in minutes. Perhaps as many as 7,000 died. Then, at war's end, it was Germany's liners and cruise ships which toiled to evacuate their own civilians from a vengeful Soviet Red Army. The Goya, the Steuben, and the Wilhelm Gustloff were all torpedoed, simply loaded with civilians, and at least 18,000 people were killed in all. This was the pattern of horrifying destruction and the waste of precious human life which so characterized the Second World War, and at sea, it had all started with the loss of a humble little liner named the SS Athenia. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.